Something new today, see if it works. We are going to try using my cell phone as a remote control today. So we are recording, excellent. Let's go ahead and hit present. We'll take attendance. All right, looks like we're almost all in for attendance purposes. That's fantastic. We'll minimize that, keep that open, start our presentation. All right, so let's see if this works. Da, da, da. Can I scribble on the screen? It worked. I love it when things work. All right, guys, we're going to talk about skin and subcutaneous tissues today. Hopefully you were able to watch the lecture recordings on glands and epithelial membranes, and also watch the lecture recording on connective tissues, muscular tissues, and nervous tissue. There really wasn't that much on the nervous and muscular, but boy, was there a lot of connective tissues to talk about. So let's talk about our skin. Now, when we look at our skin, or our integumentary system, it includes, well, the skin, the hair, and the nails. Skin, hair, and nails. Most people have no problem associating skin with the integumentary system. Associating your hair with the integumentary system, or your fingernails and your toenails, that can be a little bit trickier for a lot of students. Now, when we think of our skin, it's one of the most vulnerable organs in that it's exposed on the surface of our bodies. It's constantly being bombarded with the outside environment. So today we had cold, dry air. In the summer you have warm, moist air. And we have lots and lots of pathogens constantly bombarding our skin. As we look at our skin, there's a couple names. We're just going to do some word clarification. Derm is a root word that means skin. Integument also can mean skin. And then, well, I also hear people say skin for skin. So when we think of dermatology, or the dermis, or subdermal injections, these all have to do with the skin. So when we look at our skin, dermatology is ology for study of. Dermatology would be the study of skin. And when we look at our skin, it can be broken up into a couple layers. We're going to talk about each of these layers of our skin. That top layer of our skin is the epidermis. Epi for superficial or above. So we'll have a section dedicated to the epidermis being peeled up there. The epidermis is, generally speaking, going to be the non-living portion of our skin made of epithelial tissues. Then we have the dermis of our skin. And that dermis on our skin is going to be categorized as the living portion in most situations of our skin. The dermis is going to be made of primarily connective tissues with a little bit of epithelial tissues mixed in. And then underneath the dermis, or deep to the dermis, we have the hypodermis. And the hypodermis is kind of the odd duck out. We just don't know which organ system or which body system to categorize it with. So we put it with the skin. It's technically not part of the skin, but every anatomy and physiology textbook under the sun always groups it with the skin. So as we look at our skin, it has the skin, our hair, our nails. The one I didn't emphasize before was the glands. There are lots of secretions that are being made on our skins. We have our sweat, we have our oil, we have our mucus, we have our earwax, we have that weird funky stuff that builds up in your belly button. All those different secretions all come from our integumentary system. When we look at the skin, it's the biggest organ in the body. Let's think of the definition of an organ. An organ is something that has two or more tissues working together for a common purpose. So when we look at the skin, we have stratified squamous epithelium in the epidermis. We have dense, irregular connective tissues in the dermis, and then there's some areolar and some adipose tissues in the hypodermis as well. There's multiple tissue types working together to help maintain homeostasis for our body. Now, when we think of the weight of our skin, being the largest organ and being the outer perimeter of our body, it's going to be a good chunk of our body weight. Now, this 15% of our body weight can fluctuate based on the thickness of the hypodermis. The hypodermis is, generally speaking, going to be made up of adipose tissue. And individuals with more adipose tissue will have their skin make up a larger proportion of their body mass. So when we look at this 15% figure, this is an approximation for a generalized adult. Now, as we look at these layers of our skin, the epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis, I need to emphasize again, I think this is the third time I've said this, the hypodermis is not technically part of the skin. Now, on our integumentary system, or our skin, we have two broad categories of skin, thick skin and thin skin. As we look at the thick skin, that thick skin is going to be on our palms of our hands and on the bottom of our feet. Thin skin is everywhere else on our bodies. And just because we have thick skin and thin skin, there's going to be kind of a gradient. There's degrees of thickness. Think of that callus you have on the bottom of your foot. That's going to be a lot thicker than the skin probably on the palm of your hand, even though they're both technically categorized as thick skin. Or if we think of thin skin, the skin on your shoulders is technically thin skin, but it's still a heck of a lot thicker than the skin of your eyelid or your palpebrae. So there's going to be kind of a spectrum of thickness within these categories, but we can have these two broad categories based on the layers in the epidermis. The thick skin is going to have an extra layer in the epidermis. That's one of the ways we categorize it, the extra layer in the epidermis of the thick skin. Another way we can categorize thick skin versus thin skin is the presence of glands and hair follicles. Let's think structure and function. If we had hair growing on the bottom of our feet, we would slip constantly. It would hurt constantly when we pulled it out and got it stuck on something. It wouldn't be very functional to have hair on the bottom of our feet or on the palm of our hands. And what we find with thick skin is that thick skin does not have any hair follicles. You've probably heard the stereotype of sweaty hands or sweaty feet. Thick skin does have a lot of sweat glands, also known as sudoriferous glands, and our thick skin also is going to have a lot of sebaceous glands. We need to moisturize that skin that's present. Now, when we think of thin skin, everything other than your hands and feet, it does have hair follicles, with a few exceptions, the labia minora and the shaft of the penis and glans penis in the male anatomy. Other than that, thin skin has hair follicles. So what does our skin do for us? Oh, question.
So part of your hands don't have hair, so they're thick skin, but in the back of your hand has hair, so it's like thin skin. Like it can change that quickly from like a short.
Oh, absolutely. I'll repeat your question out loud for the rest of the class. So the question was about the palm of your hand versus the back of your hand. The palm of your hand is thick skin. It does not have hair follicles, but if you flip your hand over, the back of your hand or the posterior of your hand does have hair follicles. It is thin skin. It's a very quick transition. Exactly the same with the feet as well. So when we look at our skin, one of the key functions of our skin is to resist trauma. We have multiple layers of cells, stratified squamous epithelium on the surface. And not only is it just a regular stratified squamous, this stratified squamous tissue has keratin in it. It's also going to have an extra tough waterproof protein inside of the cells to give it extra toughness. We're also going to have dermicidin and defensins. You don't need to bother memorizing those specific names of the specific chemical compounds. What I want you to think of when you look at those compounds is that these compounds that I just crossed out And I didn't mean to cross them out. Sorry, small screen. Those chemical compounds are antimicrobial. Our skin has antimicrobial chemical compounds built in. Another antimicrobial feature of our skin that's built in is the acid mantle. Your sweat has a lot of uric acid in it. And that uric acid that's present in your sweat acidifies your skin and makes it inhospitable for many microorganisms. It's too acidic of an environment for many things to grow. Our skin is also going to serve as a barrier for our bodies. We do not live in an aqueous environment, so we need to keep liquid in our bodies. That's keratin in our epidermis keeps water in. For burn victims that lose their epidermis, dehydration is a major problem because they no longer have that waterproof barrier to keep them hydrated. Our skin is going to serve to prevent UV radiation damage. It's also going to allow us to have vitamin D synthesis, and this is a common misconception people have. A lot of individuals will say, we need to go outside so we can make vitamin D. I'm going to be picky with my language here. We need to go outside so we can activate vitamin D. This whole process of making vitamin D is a two-step process. We need to take this molecule, this vitamin D molecule, activate it in our dermis, in our hypodermis, or our epidermis. When we expose it to UV radiation, it's then sent to the liver where the process is finished. We use our skin for sensation. We have a lot of thermoreceptors in our skin, whether for hot or cold. We have nociceptors for pain. We have light touch. We have deep pressure. We have all these different kinds of sensory receptors present in our skin. We're also going to use our skin to regulate our body temperatures. Individuals that have burns have trouble regulating their body temperatures when they lose this very important organ. We are going to have in our skin, particularly in the hypodermis, a lot of adipose tissue. And that adipose tissue serves to insulate us. We're also going to have present in our skin some vasoconstrictors. These vasoconstrictors are smooth muscles that will constrict the blood vessels in our skin. So think about when you're overheating. When you overheat, you send more blood to the surface, your skin becomes bright red, you become flushed, and you're using your blood to take heat from the core of your body to the surface to help cool you off quicker. That's a way that our skin can help regulate our body temperatures. And then finally, with our sudoriferous or sweat glands, we're going to have perspiration. That very serous or watery secretion will help to cool us off as the water evaporates off of the surface of our bodies. We also use our skin for, well, nonverbal communication, raising an eyebrow or giving somebody the look. There's a lot of nonverbals that can happen with our skin. So, let's test our knowledge. The skin carries out the first step with vitamin D synthesis. True or false? So we've got about 25 seconds left if you haven't answered yet. Looks like we're waiting on about 7 people. So guys, gals, the answer is true, and we crushed it. Good work. Let's talk about the epidermis, that most superficial layer of our skin. Our epidermis has a keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. So we're going to have many layers of flattened cells filled with keratin. Now think back to the last chapter, think back to lab. Epithelial tissues do not have blood vessels. So when we look at the epidermis, there are no blood vessels present because it's an epithelium, and this is a good thing. Think of structure and function. Our epidermis is constantly being attacked, it's constantly being damaged. If we had blood vessels in our epidermis, we would constantly be bleeding. So thank goodness we don't have those blood vessels present. Generally speaking, our epidermis doesn't have nerve endings. Every once in a while you'll find a nerve ending or two. Generally speaking, when we think of nerve endings, we're going to associate them with the dermis of the skin. And when you think of epidermis, I want you to think of no blood vessels and, generally speaking, no nerve endings, even though there's just a couple present. In our epidermis, we're going to have some cell types present. We have stem cells, and the stem cells present in our epidermis are going to be multipotent stem cells, or adult stem cells. Speaking of multipotent or adult stem cells, it was all over the news yesterday and the day before. Did anyone read the article about HIV remission, HIV type 1 remission? Yeah, that was a big deal. There are some people that are naturally resistant to type 1 HIV, and adult stem cells were harvested from those individuals and put into patients that had type 1 HIV, and now for the second time ever, somebody is in complete remission of HIV after being treated and after not having natural immunity to it. It's a big deal, very big deal, which is why it even was on CNN. Most of the time the cool stuff doesn't get there. So let's talk about the keratinocytes. A keratinocyte is a cell that makes keratin. Cyte for cell, what does it do? Well, it makes keratin. Most of the cells of our epidermis are going to be keratinocytes. The vast majority are keratinocytes. We're also going to have melanocytes, or melanocytes. I'm more of a melanocyte kind of guy. And when we think of our melanocytes, I want you to think of cells that make melanin, or pigmentation. These are the pigment cells of our skin. These are what give us the skin color differences between very white, kind of brownish, or kind of blackish skin. We'll have a few tactile cells. These tactile cells that are present in our epidermis are going to be those few sensory receptor cells. And I'll admit, in all of my years of staring at skin histology slides, and I've probably put in on just skin histology a good 20 to 30 hours on a microscope looking at skin slides, I've never actually seen a tactile cell. Now, if we did the correct kind of microscopy, we'd probably see them, but they just aren't that common in the epidermis. Something that is fairly common in the epidermis, though, is dendritic cells. These dendritic cells of our epidermis serve an immune function. Dendrite is the root word of the dendritic cell, and when we think of that root word dendritic or dendrite, think of branching. A dendrologist is somebody who studies trees. A dendritic cell is a cell with many branches coming off of it, and it looks like kind of like a tree. And this dendritic cell will have all of these branches kind of worming us, coming off of it, squeezing in between the cells of the skin, those keratinocytes. And as those dendritic cells will squeeze in between the keratinocytes, they will serve to destroy pathogens that are trying to burrow their way through the epidermis. So here's a figure from your text to help lay this out for you. Our dendritic cell on this screen is going to be the green one, the big branching cell. And this big branching cell, it's right there circled in orange. We're also going to have present in the skin the melanocytes. Those melanocytes typically are going to be colored brown. We'll also have present stem cells, and these stem cells usually are going to be right along the bottom layer of the epidermis, forming that very bottom layer, or the deepest layer. And then finally, we'll also have some tactile cells as well, which really aren't shown in here. So let's move on to the layers of our epidermis. When we think of thick skin versus thin skin, let's reiterate this again. Thick skin has 5 layers to the epidermis. Thin skin has 4 layers to the epidermis. And as we're talking about these layers, we'll go from deepest to superficial. The deepest layer, or the deepest strata, is the stratum basale, which means the basement layer. Stratum is a word that refers to layer, and then basale is a word that refers to basal or basement. So the stratum basale is one of the easy layers to identify in our skin, in the epidermis. It's one cell thick. It's one layer of cells thick, and it's where we're going to have those stem cells, those multipotent adult stem cells that are constantly dividing, constantly regenerating our skin. We'll have a few melanocytes, a few tactile cells present in the epidermis, but overwhelmingly it's going to be made up of stem cells that differentiate into keratinocytes. We'll have the melanocytes present at the stratum basale, and as those melanocytes are pumping out pigmentation, pumping out melanin, the melanin gets embedded in the keratinocytes and colors the keratinocytes, gives them their pigmentation. Above the stratum basale, the next layer up is the stratum spinosum. And when we look at the stratum spinosum, a key characteristic of that layer is it's right above the stratum basale. So in lab next week, when you're looking at the microscope slide, the deepest layer of the epidermis is always the stratum basale. One cell above that is going to be the stratum spinosum. Now, if we look at the cells within the stratum spinosum, they have kind of a spiny appearance. It almost looks like they're starting to crenulate. And what's happening with these cells in the stratum spinosum is they are losing their cytoplasm. In stratum basale, they don't look very squamous. But the cells from the stratum basale are going to start changing shape and losing their cytoplasm as they move up through the epidermis. So we start to see this morphing, or this changing of morphology in the stratum spinosum. Our next layer up, so the third layer up. So we go from stratum basale, stratum spinosum. Up next is the stratum granulosum. Our stratum granulosum is not terribly thick. In lab next week, when you're looking at your skin slides, the key thing I want to emphasize for you is that there's dark granules. It's almost a specular, polka dotted appearance to the cells of the stratum granulosum. This next layer, stratum lucidium, should be circled. The stratum lucidium is only present in thick skin. Thin skin does not have the stratum lucidium. Stratum lucidium is only present in our palms and the bottom of our feet. This is the layer that is added to thick skin and is not present in thickened skin. And then finally we have the stratum corneum. The stratum corneum is going to be the most superficial layer of our epidermis. It's made of fully keratinized melanocytes. Another word for keratinized is cornified, and most textbooks don't use that as a verb anymore. It's kind of an old school term. We still use corneum though when we think of the layer of the skin, the layer of the epidermis. Some of you maybe have corns on the bottom of your feet. If you have a corn on the bottom of your feet, you have a highly developed or overdeveloped stratum corneum. Let's talk about the keratinocyte, the most common cell present in our epidermis. That keratinocyte will start out as an adult stem cell present in the stratum basale of the epidermis. And those adult stem cells are constantly dividing. They have a very, very high rate of mitosis and cytokinesis, and they're going to be regenerating the keratinocytes constantly. Billions of keratinocytes per day, because we're losing billions of keratinocytes per day. Now, when we look at those keratinocytes, the new ones will be made at the stratum basale. They push up to the stratum spinosum. They keep moving up through the stratum granulosum, the stratum lucidium, and finally they arrive at the stratum corneum, at the most superficial layer of our epidermis. And as these keratinocytes are constantly pushing up, they serve a very important function. they are going to make it difficult for pathogens to get into our bodies. If you are a bacterium, if you're a paramecium or some kind of burrowing multicellular pathogen, you have to swim upstream, so to speak. You're trying to burrow or move through the layers of the epidermis, but that epidermis is constantly regrowing new layers that you have to swim through or burrow through. And the moment you stop moving, that's the moment that you start moving out of the body and away from the blood vessels. Out of curiosity, has anyone ever had swimmer's itch in here? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about burrowing parasites in your epidermis. I had that when I was a young boy. I went swimming in the pond scum against my parents' best judgment. And I had this outbreak of big, itchy red welts all over my body. And this is a parasite that's present in north central and south central Wisconsin called swimmer's itch that normally infects snails, but occasionally, if it comes to a human being, will try to burrow through your epidermis, and it doesn't make it. It can't make it through your epidermis, but instead it dies at the halfway point. And then you have all these dead parasites in your bodies that cause all these red, oozy itches. It's not fun. Now, when we think of our keratinocytes, we have this regeneration process that slows down as we age. So if we look at individuals that are more on the geriatric end of the spectrum, they have a harder time regenerating their epidermis. They have a harder time recovering from damage to their epidermis. Let's talk about our stratum granulosum. Those keratinocytes, when they make it to the stratum granulosum, are going to be bound together. So the keratin that's present within the cell is bound together. And we're also going to have some envelope proteins on their membranes as well. So the cells in that layer get attached to each other, and the proteins within the cells get attached to each other. We're also going to have some waterproofing added as well. So there'll be some membrane vesicles, some surface vesicles present in the skin cells or the keratinocytes that are going to release lipids to the extracellular environment to help with the waterproofing. And at this part of our skin, the stratum granulosum is where death occurs for the keratinocytes. So our keratinocytes cease to be living at this point. So at this point, they typically, or after this point, they typically just dry out and become flattened to assume that characteristic squamous shape of the stratified squamous epithelium. Now within our stratum granulosum, since we're having those lipids released, this is where the waterproof barrier begins. So as we're looking at the waterproofing of our skin, it starts at the stratum granulosum. Our stratum basale and our stratum spinosum are not waterproof layers of our skin. So, let's pause for a moment and do a concept check. The fastest rate of mitosis happens where in our skin? We have 5 layers of the skin, 5 options. Where's our fastest rate of mitosis? Where is there going to be the most division of the nucleus of the cell? Another way of thinking of this is, where are the stem cells in our epidermis? We're down to about 10 seconds. Guys, gals, the fastest rate of mitosis is going to be in the stratum basale. That's where the adult stem cells are located. That's where we're constantly going to be regenerating the keratinocytes. Let's move on and focus on the dermis of our skin. So we talked about the epidermis. That's the most superficial layer of our skin, made of epithelial tissues. This dermis is the next deepest layer. Our dermis is made of connective tissues. And a key component or a key characteristic of the connective tissues of our dermis is that there are blood vessels present. So this is going to be vascularized. So if you start to bleed, that means the puncture wound made it down to the dermis, the puncture or the slice, we could say. Now, our dermis, like our epidermis, will vary in thickness. Parts of our skin, like on our eyelids, will have a very thin dermis, just like it has a very thin epidermis. Other parts of our bodies, where we have thick skin, will have a thicker dermis to help support that thicker epidermis. The most important, or the single most common protein present in our dermis is collagen. Think back to lab last week, and when you were looking at that dense, irregular connective tissue, there were collagen fibers pointing in all different directions in the dermis of our skin. Now, on our dermis, if we look at, let's back up a little bit here. Here we go. As we look at our dermis, guys, gals, I want to emphasize something for you, and that is the wavy appearance of the dermis. Our dermis goes up and down. There's ridges that are present in the dermis. And those ridges that are present in the dermis serve a very important function. They give us our friction ridges, or they give us our fingerprints and our footprints, or toe prints. I'm not sure what the term is, the correct term for that. A friction reduction on the foot. So let's go ahead here, back to where we were. And we'll go back to full screen. So as we look at the dermis, there's two primary layers to the dermis. We're going to have the layer that's most superficial directly against the epidermis. That's known as the papillary layer, where we have a lot of dermal papillae. And that's what's ultimately going to give us the fingerprints, or the friction ridges in our hands and the friction ridges that are on our foot or feet. So let's talk papillary layer. It's the most superficial layer. Our papillary layer is going to have a lot of blood vessels present. And one of the reasons why there's so many blood vessels present within our papillary layer is because this papillary layer is not only supporting itself, it's going to keep the cells of the stratum basale and the cells of the stratum spinosum alive. So all of these nutrients from the papillary layer need to diffuse through the deep layers of the epidermis to keep those cells alive within the epidermis. The deep layer of the dermis is known as the reticular layer. And this reticular layer is where we're going to find all of that collagen. This is our characteristic layer of the dermis. It's the thickest layer of the dermis. Sometimes we'll have stretch marks occur in our bodies. These are common if you have rapid weight fluctuations, or think of pregnancies. These stretch marks occur when the collagen fibers in the dermis, in particular in the reticular layer of the dermis, are all pulled straight. And if they're all pulled so that they're parallel with each other, in other words, if you stretch out the skin, those collagen fibers will be visible through the epidermis as stretch marks. Here are those layers again. We have, and I love this slide, we have our reticular layer. That's deep, and then we have the papillary layer in blue forming those ridges. And if we look at the photomicrograph of those two layers, the papillary layer is going to focus primarily on having lots of blood vessels in it. So here's our papillary layer. And then if we look at the reticular layer, it's going to have lots and lots of collagen fibers present in it. Let's move on to our hypodermis. When we think of the hypodermis, this is, again, technically not part of the skin, but since there's no better place to put it, we'll group it with the skin, with our systemic approach. It's going to be a subcutaneous tissue. Let's break apart this word, subcutaneous. Sub means beneath. What is it beneath? It's beneath the cutan, or beneath the skin. This is a layer of tissue beneath the skin. And depending on your body composition, we'll typically have areolar and adipose tissue. And most individuals, particularly most Americans, will have a lot of adipose tissue present and not that much areolar tissue present. You can think of the adipose tissue that's present in the hypodermis as just a storage location. When we think of how adipose tissue could serve as an insulator, it makes sense that we put the insulative tissue near the surface of our bodies to keep our heat in our bodies so we can better regulate our body temperatures. When we look at the areolar tissue that's present in the hypodermis, I want you to think of the areolar tissue as glue or sticky tack. It helps to hold everything together or bind the various layers together. If somebody is going to have a hypodermic injection or a subcutaneous injection, this is going to be injection into typically the superficial fat or the adipose tissue of the hypodermis. While we're talking about putting things into our skin, we should back up a little bit here because I forgot to mention this one. When you get a tattoo, the ink is put into the dermis of your skin. The needles will inject ink into the dermis of your skin. And since the dermis isn't constantly pushing new layers to the surface, that ink can remain, hopefully, for your lifetime. If the tattoo ink doesn't make it into the dermis, if it only goes on the epidermis, it'll be sloughed off in about 30 days. So this is one of the reasons why getting a tattoo is typically associated with a needle that draws blood, because it has to puncture down into the dermis where you have lots of blood vessels present. When we think of the subcutaneous fat, we use it for insulation, we use it as an energy reservoir. Generally speaking, females are going to have a thicker layer of subcutaneous fat or a higher body fat composition. Generally speaking, and I'm speaking from like a WIA wrestling perspective, when I was in high school, males were allowed to cut down to 4.5% body fat. Females, according to the WIA regulations, were allowed to go down to about 9% body fat. And that's just because of the gender differences that are present in body fat composition. Females need that extra body fat. When we look at infants, they generally speaking don't have as much of a hypodermis. The infants are going to have less of adipose tissue present, particularly less white fat present. Infants are known for having a lot of brown fat present. And then you may have noticed for geriatric or elderly individuals, they have a hard time regulating their body pressures, or body temperatures, I should say. So oftentimes they're going to be in an environment where the heat is turned up really high, and they'll oftentimes have a blanket on their lap to help make up for the lack of adipose tissue that's present in their hypodermis. So here we have our hypodermis, that thick layer underneath the skin, made up of a lot of adipose tissue and a little bit of areolar tissue to help bind everything together. So let's do another concept check. Which of the following best describes the composition of the dermis? The dermis is mostly going to be made of our reticular layer. The reticular layer has a lot of a special kind of protein present in it. So think about what that protein is in the reticular layer of our dermis. I think I'll add a few more seconds for you here, just based on the responses. So we're down to 30 seconds. Ten more seconds. So when we think of the reticular layer, it has lots of collagen in it. Collagen is a fibrous protein. The cells that make fibrous proteins are fibroblasts. So this question, I love this question because it connects the dots between chapter 5 and chapter 6. In chapter 5, we talked about fibroblasts. We were focusing on histologies and the cells of connective tissues. And then we connected that to chapter 6 when we're talking about the composition of the dermis. Let's talk about our skin color. The single most important pigment in our skin color is melanin. And I'm emphasizing the ending here. It ends with a melanin. A lot of students will mix this up with a hormone that regulates your sleep cycle called melatonin. Melatonin makes you sleepy. Melanin gives you nice color to your epidermis. So they sound very similar to each other, but they are two different things. We'll talk about melatonin when we get to the endocrine system. Melanin is that pigmentation. So the cell that makes the melanin is the melanocyte. Melanocytes produce or secrete the melanin. The melanin gets into the keratinocytes and then colors the keratinocyte. There's two kinds of melanin, eumelanin and phenomelanin. Eumelanin is the most common type. And when we look at this root word here, U is a prefix that means true. So when we think of eumelanin, this is what most people think of when they think of our stereotypical melanin. It's going to have a brown or blackish pigmentation to it or coloration to it. Phenomelanin is the new kid on the block. It was the most recently discovered pigmentation made by a melanocyte, and it's going to give you a reddish yellow coloration to your skin. You've noticed how like some people just kind of that yellow, kind of yellowish tint to their skin. A lot of times you can see this yellowish tint on corns or calluses that are present on the bottom of your feet. That yellowish coloration is from phenomelanin. And I remember being a student learning about individuals with dark skin and individuals with fair colored skin and how they both have the same number of melanocytes. And I thought that was particularly interesting. Even if you're, one of the whitest people out there or one of the dark blackest people out there, those Caucasians and those people with very darkly colored skin have the same number of pigment producing cells, so the same number of melanocytes. The differences in their skin coloration comes not from the number of pigment making cells, but from how active their individual pigment making cells are. Individuals with very darkly colored skin have more active melanocytes than individuals with very fair colored skin. And there's a hormone associated with melanocytes, and you'll love the name of this hormone. It's called melanocyte stimulating hormone. It's a very good name for a hormone. What does melanocyte stimulating hormone do? It stimulates the melanocytes to make melanin. And if you have a lot of money to blow, you can get the best artificial tan out there by ordering an injection of MSH. And you'll be able to skip the tanning booth. You'll be able to skip the spray-on tans. You'll have a wholly natural tan by getting an injection of melanocyte stimulating hormone. Now, for individuals that have that darker skin, they naturally produce more of that hormone. They have a higher baseline level of that hormone, so their melanocytes are constantly producing more melanin compared to individuals with very fair colored skin. When we look at histology, and we have, in our lab setting, we have skin slides from people with very dark skin and skin slides from individuals with fair-colored skin. What we'll notice is, particularly in the stratum basale of the epidermis, we can see the brown pigmentation from the melanocytes when somebody had darkly colored or darkly pigmented skin. So, we all know this, but it's worth emphasizing. Exposure to ultraviolet radiation can upregulate melanocyte production, or melanin production from the melanocytes, I should say. Ultraviolet radiation is something that, we need a little bit of, but we don't want too much of. We need a little bit to help activate our vitamin D. Too much ultraviolet radiation, though, is going to cause thymine dimers to form in our DNA, or cause mutations to form in our DNA. So to help regulate the amount of ultraviolet radiation that's getting down into the dermis, melanocytes will upregulate and downregulate melanin production in response to UV exposure. It's worth emphasizing here that the ultraviolet radiation that you're exposed to in a tanning booth is the exact same ultraviolet radiation I use to sterilize samples in a lab setting. Now, there are other things that are present in our skin that give us color. We have hemoglobin in our blood. It has iron in it that gives us a red pigmentation to our skin. We also have a yellow-orangish pigment known as keratin. When I think of keratin, I always think of carrots. And if you eat a lot of keratin or a very keratin-rich diet, eventually your skin, your epidermis, can assume that orange coloration. It's a pretty extreme diet, though. When we look at the skin, you can learn about a patient when you visually inspect them based on the colors of their skin. If they have blue skin, that is known as cyanosis. And that blueness is typically associated with a lack of oxygen present in the blood in the tissues you're looking at. If somebody has bright red skin, that's known as erythema, and that's going to be due to extra blood in the superficial tissues. Generally speaking, cyanosis is associated with being cold, and that oxygenated blood, or that warmer blood, is being funneled towards the internal organs to maintain the core body temperature. When somebody has erythema, they're usually overheating and sending extra blood to the surface to help cool off. If somebody has white skin and color to their hair, so if you're looking at a brunette or a redhead or somebody that has color to their hair and they have very white skin, that's going to generally be called pallor. And that's due to lack of blood flow to their skin. Now, if you're looking at somebody and they have white hair and they look like they feel pretty good and they're walking around, but they also have white skin, that's known as albinism or albinoism, as it's sometimes referred to. And that's a genetic condition where they don't make melanin in their melanocytes. If somebody has yellow skin, that's a condition known as jaundice, and that's associated with an excess of bilirubin in the bloodstream. Classic ways to treat jaundice include going to the bathroom. Number 2 is a great way to get rid of jaundice or excess bilirubin in your bodies. And in extreme situations, we're going to see individuals be exposed to UV lamps. If somebody has blue, purple, or green colorations kind of modeled together, that's a hematoma, aka a bruise. And I want to camp on this one for a little bit. If somebody is unbelievably tan, who should not be unbelievably tan, that's a disease known as Addison's disease. In my own life, I met somebody and knew somebody who had Addison's disease. He was a Caucasian individual who was so tan that he didn't look Caucasian anymore. And usually the classic red flag is if their gum lines start to become tan as a Caucasian. That's a big sign of Addison's disease. When we look at our skin color, people that are from the tropics have a darker skin color. If you are not from the tropics, you typically have less melanin, so you can absorb UV radiation. So being away from the tropics or having fairer color skin allows for you to have adequate UV radiation get to your skin so that you can make enough, so that you can activate enough vitamin D. And then finally, there is a sexual selection preference as well for skin color. Individuals have, personal preference. Maybe you find a certain skin pigmentation more attractive than another skin pigmentation. So who you choose to mate with will help influence the skin color of your offspring. When we look at friction ridges on our skin, and this will be our last slide, we'll call it quits here. When we look at those friction ridges or fingerprints, everyone has a very unique fingerprint. Even identical twins have different fingerprints on their bodies. We also have flexion lines. Flexion lines on our bodies are where creases and folds will form, typically as we move and bend. And we'll finish this up on Friday.